Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Talk Show. A week ago today, Professor Curtis of Columbia University and I discussed the worldwide phenomena of both political and administrative sclerosis, which has come increasingly to the surface around the world. And today we are going to discuss the subject of Japanese studies in the United States. And like a week ago today, the guest for today is very eminently qualified to deal with the subject of Japanology in America because he has been in the forefront of Japanology in that country. And in order to deal with this very broad subject, I think we are going to divide the subject into the following 4 sub-items or issues. In the first place, we are going to very briefly look back upon the historical background of what was then known as Japanology, or what is currently known as Japanese studies. And so the first item is somewhat historical, in order to give us a better perspective of Japanese studies in the United States. Then, in order to elaborate on this first item of historical background of Japanology in America, we are going to address ourselves to the very gradual yet very conspicuous shift of emphasis seen in the academic pursuit of Japan in the United States. And I would refer to it in Japanese as shiten no hensen. Shift of emphasis or shift of angle, perhaps. And the third item is very closely related, both to the first item and to the second item. And I would refer to it in Japanese as yokowari versus tatewari. I am well aware that these two terms are very ambiguous or elusive, and therefore I should like to call upon Professor Curtis to elaborate on these two terms later on, except to point out that what I would call the horizontal approach is somewhat akin to the area study approach, or area studies approach, in which Japan, for example, as a socio-cultural entity or as a political economic entity, is dealt with from an overall point of view. Whereas the vertical approach is similar to the traditional, conventional disciplinary approach, in which a well-trained economist, for example, focuses his academic attention on Japan as an economy. A political scientist like Dr. Curtis addresses himself to Japan as a political entity from the standpoint of political science. And I think that we are now in the midst of the convergence of these two approaches as far as Japanese studies in the United States are concerned. And I would like to call upon Dr. Curtis to further enlarge upon this topic. And finally, in order to make this program more personal, I would like to ask Professor Curtis to let us in on what kind of research projects he has in mind for the immediate future or for the foreseeable future. And also, I hope Dr. Curtis will tell us a little bit about the kind of research projects he has been involved with in the past as well as at present. Well, this is the overall format that I intend to follow during the rest of this half-hour show. And, oh yes, before I forget, I have to put down on the board the last item in Japanese, lest you think that I purposely omitted it. His own research projects or programs. All right? Hi, Jerry.
Hello.
Welcome back to our show. The first question, not really a question, but a request. Would you give us a brief historical background of Japanology in America?
Sure. The study of Japan really got its start in the States in that period between the First and the Second World War, when there were a large number of missionaries in Japan, and either those missionaries themselves or their children went back to the States and tried to, in an academic fashion, spread information about Japan. And some of the real pioneers in the field of Japanese studies in the U.S. come out of that background, so-called first generation.
Yes.
Ambassador Reischauer or Professor Hall at Yale and Dr. Hugh Borton, who's at Columbia, and several others were sort of the early pioneers. But it was a very small group of people.
I see.
And then with the coming of the Second World War, there was a tremendous emphasis placed in military on training Japanese language officers. And so through that period of the war, several of the people who are now extremely well known as Japan specialists got first introduced to Japan, spent a couple of years here during the occupation, and have continued to be involved in Japanese studies.
Professor Keene of Columbia?
Just at Columbia alone, Professor Keene, Professor Morley, who was Professor Passon, just about everybody in the 40 to 50-year-old age group came into Japanese studies that way.
And you yourself belong to the third generation.
I guess I've been typed as being a member of the third generation. And I guess what the third generation means is that these are people who didn't get into Japan through military service. And even after the war, with the Korean War and the like, people would come here for rest and recreation. They'd be stationed here in the military. We tend to type those people as second generation, even though they may be younger. My generation, the types of people that went into Japanese studies like myself, didn't have any military experience, really didn't know much about Japan before we got into the subject, and usually got into it for a variety of rather coincidental reasons. Either, as a poor student, particularly in the early 60s, poor student not knowing what he wanted to do, there was a tremendous amount of fellowship support available for people who would study Asian affairs. During the Kennedy administration, since unlike today, there was a great emphasis placed on training people who were specialists on Asia. I happened to come into Japanese studies that way. So the third generation sort of came in a different fashion, but yet then became very much involved in Japan as a country, as a subject, and spend more or less spend most of the time about Japan. Now I still think of myself as being a young person, but already I'm now an old timer because there's a fourth generation. And one of the problems is every generation starts off by criticizing the preceding one. So now I am suffering the fates of hearing the fourth generation younger fellows tell me what's wrong with the third generation scholarship. But there is a fourth generation.
I see.
And who emphasize much more the disciplinary approach. Japan is a case study kind of approach. So that basically is the stream of developments. And one other thing to mention in that historical stream is that the number of people in Japanese studies has increased with each generation.
That's interesting.
Which is a very useful, that's a very encouraging thing.
But talking slightly in personal terms, before you went into Japanese studies, you were trained as a jazz pianist. Am I right?
That's right. But obviously I wasn't good enough, otherwise I would have stayed with it.
What, in your opinion, Jerry, of the basic weaknesses and strengths of the third generation breed of Japanologists in America?
Well, it's difficult to say since I'm one of them. We tend to be modest about our strengths and ignorant of our weaknesses. But I would think the major one of the characteristics of my generation of specialists or students of Japan is that we still are very strongly involved in trying to look at other aspects of Japan that affect its politics, say as a political scientist, rather than a narrow disciplinary approach. And I think unlike the earlier specialists, because of the schooling changes in general university education in the United States, we have a rather deep training in disciplinary fields, but not as much as the next generation that's quickly catching up behind us. So still a strong area expertise or interest but with a stronger disciplinary interest than previous specialists as a rule, but not as well trained as my students.
So your generation, the third generation Japanologists are not as well trained as the fourth generation specialists in respective disciplines. In what way? In quantitative ways or what?
It differs by discipline.
Surely.
For instance, in economics, all second, third, and fourth generation are they're good economists. Professor Patrick at Yale is second generation. Professor Saxonhouse at Michigan is third generation. Very fine economists.
What about Professor Losofsky?
And Professor Losofsky at Harvard is also now chairman of he was chairman of the economics department, now dean of the faculty at Harvard. A very fine scholar, plus a Japan specialist. But I think in sociology, political science, anthropology, in those fields, partly it's because of the changing nature of university of the disciplinary training. But my generation, particularly at Columbia, was trained in rather traditional political science tools, techniques, with little emphasis on quantitative approach, which I find personally congenial. I don't particularly go very much with behavioral political science. But nonetheless, this new generation is very adept at dealing with statistics and so on and so forth. But the generational gaps, I think, are becoming much smaller now. Most of the third generation people go back to summer school to learn quantitative methods, and the fourth generation is still struggling to learn the Japanese language. So there's a meeting ground there, which I think we're approaching. And that is, obviously, the goal is somebody who is well-versed in Japanese affairs, can speak the language, can handle the tools of political science and sociology comfortably, and can relate Japan to the rest of the world.
I think that you have very succinctly portrayed the second item on our agenda, that is the shift of emphasis. So this time, let me ask you this question. To what extent can these Japanese American experts on Japan influence the American foreign policy, for example, vis-a-vis Japan?
This is a very difficult issue. One of the problems is that specialists on Japan tend to talk to each other. It's a relatively small group of people, but we spend most of our time writing articles that our other specialist friends will read, and very little time writing for a broader audience. And it's, I think, an issue that has come to be of great concern to specialists in the field. How can you exercise influence or educate the American public at large about Japan if everything you write is written in a code language that only other political scientists can understand? So I think there hasn't been, in that sense, as much of a role played by Japan specialists in general education about Japan for the American public as there should be.
I see.
But that'll probably change. Yet on the other hand, I think there's been a role played by Japan specialists in educating or being informants for decision makers in the United States. Now, of course, Professor Reischauer is the outstanding example, a man who actually came out into public policy and was an ambassador and advisor to the State Department and so on. But many other specialists are often called upon by people in decision-making roles or by newspaper editors and the like for advice about what's going on about Japan, and in that indirect sense have some influence. But I would think relatively minor. If anything, in the last few years, with Japan's growing, the realization of Japan's importance in the world, a lot of people who know very little about Japan have come out here to spend a few weeks, find out about the country, and have gone back and have had tremendous influence. People who have influence in other realms. Herman Kahn or Brzezinski and some Joseph Kraft, newspaper columnists, syndicated columnists, outstanding academics. Those kinds of people, I think, have a tremendous impact.
I see.
So one of the roles of Japan specialists is to try to influence them.
May I assume from your statement that Japan, even today, remains very much something of as an enigma, or a mystery, or an esoteric entity to most of the American public?
I think that's true. The nature of the enigma has changed. The nature of the mystery has changed. But it's still a country that's very little understood and always looked at with perplexity. You know, why is
perplexity?
Why is Japan this way? Or how can Japan be this or that or the other thing? And little, I think, deep understanding. But that situation is changing. At least the image of Japan is changing. And every year when I teach my course on Japanese politics, the first class I give a little questionnaire about, you know, what's the first thing you think of when you hear the word Japan, and so on and so forth. Or, you know, do you know the name of the Prime Minister of Japan? Well, it's really been quite extraordinary how fundamentally the image of Japan has changed, just say in the past 5 years. One thing, the level of knowledge is much higher now.
I see.
People know the name of the Prime Minister today, where 5 years ago maybe only 20% of students who took a course on Japan knew who he was. And the image has changed from one of Mount Fuji and cherry blossoms or Pearl Harbor to one of transistor radios, militarism. In other words, whatever is in the papers tends to get relatively quickly reflected in the public mind, which only again points up the importance of having adequate reporting on Japan.
I see.
One of the other important differences that have occurred in only the past 3 years, I perhaps should mention at this point, is about, say up to 3-4 years ago, I remember writing an article for a Japanese journal on the communications gap between Japan and the United States during the textile dispute, in which I indicated that coverage in the Japanese press of American news was infinitesimally greater than coverage of Japanese news in the American press. Well, now in only 3 years' time, there's still a gap, but the amount of coverage in the American press of Japan is quite high. Compared with other foreign countries, it's extremely high in the news weeklies or whatever. The problem now is, you know, just like people are saying, instead of the quantity of life, GNP, concerned about the quality of life. Well, in terms of Japanese-American relations, instead of the quantity of news, the problem now is the quality of news.
I see.
Not how much how much of space newspapers give to Japan, but how accurate the news is, and that's a difficult problem.
This enormous increase in the in the coverage of Japan in the American mass media was triggered perhaps by the fact that Japan appears to be a problem child to the American people?
I think that, the American press goes by the standard, good news is no news, and bad news is interesting. And so with the deterioration in U.S.-Japanese relations for the past 4 years or so, there's been increased attention. And then misunderstanding in itself provokes attention.
Yes.
Assumptions that Japan has to play a greater role in the world because it's rich.
Yes.
Or the assumption that Japan is rich itself.
Yes.
As rich as the United States kind of image is very strong in the States.
I'm afraid we'll have to go on to the third item, and that is the comparative analysis of the lateral approach versus the horizontal approach. Any comments from you?
Well, as we were saying earlier, in the sort of the distinctions between the generations of Japan specialists, one of the problems, the basic problem, is how do you match up area expertise with the demands of the discipline, which, put it another way, is how do you tell people who are not specialists on Japan things about Japan that are meaningful to them. One of the problems with area specialists is that we tend to take for granted that other people have as much knowledge about the area as we do. And so we talk at a level that's understandable only to other area specialists and probably interesting to only other area specialists. But if, as a political scientist, you're interested in Japan, then obviously one of your roles in life is to try to make understandable to other political scientists who know nothing about Japan what is Japanese politics all about. And so that to do that, you have to have deeper understanding or deep understanding of politics as occurs in other countries, be able to talk in the language of the discipline.
I see.
And so there's been an increasing move away, in a sense, away from area specialization towards disciplinary specialization. And it's hard to draw a balance. People who go too far in the disciplinary area end up not being able to really deal with Japan very effectively. They spend more time learning statistics than they do learning language, or more time trying to deal in disciplinary terms, less time trying to understand the total fabric of the society. So it's a continuing problem of how you can relate Japan to other phenomena in the world in a meaningful way. And I think the problem is intensified by the difficulty of dealing with Japan as a country. If American studies French politics, it's relatively easy to get the language under his belt. There's a basic cultural similarity so that the world, France, doesn't look so strange. Obvious differences in the political system, but in a way that's really basically intelligible to an American. When you come to Japan, of course, then you're dealing with a totally different kind of situation. Excuse me. With a very different situation. And people who are serious about Japanese studies tend to be constantly pulled into doing more work on Japan. It's interesting. It's challenging. And it's important. So we all face this problem of relating our horizontal and our vertical so that we stand up more or less on an angle.
Well put, well put. Well, talking back about the growing interest in Japan on the part of the American public, I'm certainly encouraged to hear what you have just said, because about 5 of us will have completed a tour of the United States for a period of about 20 days, visiting different cities and giving talks by the time this program goes on the air. I think we are going to leave Japan in late September, and we'll have completed a tour of about 20 different cities, giving lectures and so on. And this, what I call caravan, is going to consist of an economist, a political scientist, an anthropologist, and a couple of businessmen. And we are going to try to relate what's going on in Japan in their terms, in American terms, and in these disciplinary terms, so that we might contribute even minorly to the promotion of better appreciation of the problems Japan is faced with on the part of American friends.
Well, I think that kind of thing is extremely useful and important, and is possible only because there are people now like yourself and others who can speak English so well that there's no communications gap, at least on the language level. And that's a relatively new phenomenon in Japan. And also the fact that, as you say, this group will be visiting about 20 cities. The fact that in 20 cities there are people who are anxious to meet with Japanese specialists and to hear about Japan is also a very encouraging sign, I think.
The fourth item, in the interest of time, what kind of research projects are you thinking of engaging yourself in the future? And tell us a little bit about what you have been doing all along, particularly in connection with your book and with your study concerning the business community of Japan.
Well, as you know, that book, Election Campaigning Japanese Style, was my PhD dissertation at Columbia University. And then I was very fortunate to have it published both in the United States and in Japanese in Japan. And the reaction to it by my Japanese friends was such a good one that I'm still overwhelmed by it. And of course that's encouraged me to try to pursue the subject of looking at politics from the perspective of the politician. In other words, how do men go about trying to be elected to the Diet? How do they go about trying to get power? How do they exercise it?
Yes.
That kind of approach is one that continues to interest me. And I followed up that study with a number of short studies, one of which I'm still engaged in, which is a study of the business community in Japan, the so-called Zeikai. And I hope to complete that in some sort of a small book. And my largest grand scheme for the next couple of years is to go to Europe next year and just spend a year as a student studying European politics and European-Japanese relations, and then coming for a second year right after that to Japan and doing some large comparative study of Japanese politics compared with Europe and the United States.
Well, Jerry, it is certainly my hope that you will continue to benefit us with your very objective insight into both the weaknesses and strengths of Japanese politics as an unbiased, very objective, perceptive observer. And finally, I don't think we have any more time left, but would you say just a few words in Japanese to show the audience that you are so well versed in our language?
しかし国広先生に向かって日本語を話すのは恥ずかしいですから、あまり話しませんけれども、要するにアメリカでの日本研究を私も一人としてずっとやるつもりだし、日本研究をやる方が多くなると思うし、同じように日本ではね、アメリカ研究を、勉強なさる方が多くなればいいとは思いますけれどもね、まだ日本のアメリカ研究はどっちかというと、ある意味ではアメリカの日本研究ほど進んでない事実があるからね、お互いにもっとその国を理解する必要があるから。
いや、どうもありがとうございました。ということでですね、今実は川内さんに日本語で話をしていただいたのは、英語を勉強しておられる皆さん方にとってですね、川内さんが全然その準備なしに全くのそのオフ・ザ・カフ、つまりエクステンポレニアス、つまり即座にですね、日本語であれほど、明確に自己を表現なすったと、いうことを知ってですね、おそらく大変勇気づけられるのではないかと。つまり川内さんは日本語の勉強に志士として精を出してこられたと。その結果ですね、ただ単に話すというだけではなくて、実に見事に日本語を書かれる、あるいは大変に難しい日本語の書物をもですね、自由に読みこなすことができると。それほどのその日本語の能力をですね、政治学者としてのご専門と兼ね合った形で、身につけてこられたと。そのことは我々にとって非常に大きな勇気を与えられることだろうと思うんです。 で、いつもの番組もそうですが、今日の番組もですね、あらかじめ簡単にこんなことを話しましょうやというお約束だけはしておりましたけれども、全然その決まったこの何かスクリプトを読むとか、それを暗記するとかということでなしにですね、オフ・ザ・カフ、エクステンポレニアス、極めてこの自発的にと申しますか、その自発的にというよりもむしろ即座的にですね、お話し合いをしてきたわけでして、これが私どものトークショーの一つの何と言いますか目標でもあるわけです。つまり内容のある事柄についてかなり自由自在にですね、即座的に話をする、それをお聞きいただくことによってただ単にその英語に習熟なさるということでなくて、内容についてもですね理解を深めていただきたい、こういうのが私どもの目的であるわけです。どうも長いことご清聴ありがとうございました。